Welcome everybody and happy Hanukkah. I'm so thrilled to welcome you to learn together tonight with Eitan Kastner. Eitan is the history department co-chair at the Frisch School in Paramus, New Jersey. He has a BA from the honors program of Yeshiva College and an MA in American Religious History from the University of Chicago. I am a former colleague of Eitan's, and I am so excited to learn with you tonight. I know that it's going to be a scintillating and enriching evening for us and for the Hebrew Institute of White Plains community. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Eitan.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's wonderful to virtually be with you all. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. And I thought we could use our time together. Let me just share my screen. I thought we could spend our time together maybe viewing Hanukkah in a slightly different perspective than we usually view it. If you were to just poll random people on the street, in your community, in your congregation, what's Hanukkah all about? What's the origin of Hanukkah? I imagine you would get one of two answers. The first answer would probably be something about a little bit of oil lasting 8 days, the menorah and the temple burning bright, a miracle taking place. That's probably the most likely answer for the origin of Hanukkah. But also very possible is people would say there was a big fight between Greeks and Jews in Israel a long time ago, and Hanukkah commemorates the Jewish victory over the Greeks. And I was always taught these two stories side by side, but in reality, these two stories can take us into two very different directions. And in fact, one story often has one message, and the other story in many ways can teach us another message, which is why I subtitled this lecture, Whose Hanukkah Is It? Depending upon which story you tell, you might view Hanukkah very differently from one or the other. And so let me explain what I mean. But to do so, I'm a history teacher. I almost always start a lesson with a map. So let me introduce you to where the story takes place, and very briefly, the larger historical context in which it is taking place. And that'll help set the scene for us. Okay, so our first map is this big, beautiful one. This is the Persian Empire. This is the Persia from the Perm story. Totally different story there. Persia was one of the world's largest empires, and it ranged from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to modern-day Iran, Persia. It was a massive empire, stood for over 200 years until it was conquered by Alexander the Great. Alexander, in the 330s BCE, conquered all of Persia, expanding the borders, including modern-day Greece and Macedonia, into modern-day India, a massive empire. Alexander didn't get to enjoy it that long. He died in his 30s, and then his empire was divided up between different friends and generals of his, divided up into a number of smaller kingdoms. We don't really care about most of them right now. We just care about the two biggest ones. One kingdom was centered in modern-day Egypt, led by Alexander's, one of his main friends and generals, a man named Ptolemy, which starts with a P for some reason. And then the other was another one of his generals named Seleucus, who took over the Asian component of Alexander's empire. And you may notice, looking at the map, Israel is right in between these two kingdoms. And at some points, Israel is controlled by the Ptolemies of Egypt, and at other times, Israel is controlled by the Seleucids of Asia. And this is actually critical to understanding the story of Hanukkah, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because right off the bat, there's always some confusion. I remember when I was a kid, there was this really sort of like hokey video I owned. It was the only Jewish themed VHS video I owned. It was called Latkas, and it showed the Greeks invading Israel, conquering the temple, and the Maccabees fighting them off. That story is immensely historically wrong. My parents lied to me when they bought me that video, because in reality, Alexander conquered Israel in the 330s BCE, and the story of Hanukkah takes place just under 200 years later. In other words, there were close to 200 years where Israel was conquered by the Greeks, and there was no Hanukkah story. There were a very long time where Jews were living under Greek control, and there was no Jewish rebellion. There were no significant violent episodes, at least none that we know of. Those earliest years under Greek control, we actually don't know that much about. We don't have any contemporaneous sources from that time period that have survived, none that I'm aware of anyway. But we do start getting sources that have survived to this day by around the year 200 BCE. So after around 100 years of Jews living under Greek control, the historical record gives us a little hint as to what Jewish life was like under Greek control. And it might surprise us if our only understanding of Jews and Greeks interacting is the story of Hanukkah, because the story we have that these sources tell us is nothing like the Hanukkah story. But there still was tension. And so let me introduce you to what I mean. We have two different historical sources that tell us about what the Jews thought about Alexander conquering Israel. One of them is an interesting source, very apropos for today. It is the Book of Maccabees. The Book of Maccabees was written by the Maccabees after their victory. So this is not written from the time period of Alexander. This is written around 200 years later, but it's their understanding of what Alexander was like. And so this is the very beginning of the Book of Maccabees. Book of Maccabees is an apocryphal work. That means it was written by Jews in the style of the Tanakh, but for one reason or another, as we'll see, it didn't make it into the Tanakh, but some Christians included it into their Christian Bible as sort of a bridge between the material of the Tanakh and the Christian Bible. And so that's why we still have it. That's why this work survived. It was saved by Christians, not by Jews. And so the beginning of the first book of Maccabees goes like this. After Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated Darius, king of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributary to him. After this, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died. Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their sons after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. Okay, so this is the Maccabees version of the Greek invasion, and it's not a pretty picture. When the Maccabees talk about the Greeks invading, they make it seem like it was pretty bad. Alexander is plundering, he's conquering, he's putting to death the kings of the earth, and then his followers, well, they're even worse. That's the Maccabees version, and I'm sure there were many people who felt this way at the time. But there's another version of this story, very, very different. Now, this story was written down even later than that of the Book of Maccabees. The Book of Maccabees was probably written sometime in the 130s BCE. This next source was written down over 150 years later. But many scholars think, though this written down version of the story is later, it probably is based upon an earlier tradition. This comes from arguably one of the most famous Jews who lived around 2,000 years ago, a man named Josephus Flavius. Josephus has a fascinating story. If you ever want to hear Josephus's story, you can invite me back. We can talk about it. He's a really interesting guy. But for now, he's a famous traitor. He was a Jewish leader in the Jewish rebellion against Rome. And when he realized the Jews had no chance of winning, he switched sides to the Roman side and spent the rest of his life trying to tell the Romans, Jews, they're not so bad. He wrote a number of books that have survived to this day. But without a doubt, probably the most interesting of those was a book called The Jewish Antiquities, where he summarized all of Jewish history for a non-Jewish audience. And so here is Josephus's version of Alexander meeting the Jews, and as you'll see, is quite different from the one of the Book of Maccabees. Now, Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem. And Jaddua, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, when he heard that, was in an agony and under terror, as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians, since the king was displeased at his foregoing disobedience. He therefore ordained that the people should make supplications and should join with him in offering sacrifice to God, whom he besought to protect that nation and to deliver them from the perils that were coming upon them. Whereupon God warned him in a dream. So God is warning the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, which came upon him after he had offered sacrifice, that he should take courage and adorn the city and open the gates, that the rest should appear in white garments, but that he, the Kohen Gadol, and the priest should meet the king in the habits proper to their order, without the dread of any ill consequence, which the providence of God would prevent. Upon which, when he rose from his sleep, he greatly rejoiced and declared to all the warning he had received from God, according to which dream he acted entirely, and so waited for the coming of the king, that is Alexander. Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate whereon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander, and encompass him about, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenio alone went up to him and asked him how it came to pass that when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom he replied, I did not adore him, but the God who hath honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, and now seeing this in person in it, and remembering that vision, and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therewith conquer Darius and destroy the power of the Persians. Okay, I'll stop there. In other words, in this story, God comes to Alexander, shows him a vision of the high priest, and they all get along. There's no violence, there's no plundering. Alexander and the Jews, they're tight. They get along just fine, according to Josephus. And so, right off the bat, we have these two stories. Neither of them are contemporaneous with this moment. Neither of them are from the moment when Alexander actually met the Jews. They are written down by Jews years later. But we can see some Jews think, not so great that Alexander came. Other Jews are like, yeah, it was fine. God was cool with it. We're fine that Alexander came here. So right off the bat, we can see there is some tension regarding how bad or not bad it was when Alexander came and conquered Israel. Now, in the years that followed, the Jews who lived in Alexander's empire, and as far as I know, basically all Jews in the world at this point were living in Alexander's empire. Maybe a few scattered communities were elsewhere, but the vast, vast majority of Jews are living in places like Israel, like Egypt, like Mesopotamia, like Persia, places like that, Syria. The vast majority of Jews are living in Alexander's empire. Well, in the coming decades, they acculturate, they adapt to living in this Greek-inspired world. And we have many examples of that happening. Now, without a doubt, probably the most consequential of those is one that's quite famous. And that is the Torah gets translated into Greek. The Torah gets translated a number of points in history. Every time it happens, it's kind of a big deal. This is probably the first known example of it happening in a systematic way. And why would it be that the Torah would be translated into Greek? Well, because as time went on, Greek became the language that most Jews spoke. And they still wanted to learn the Torah. They still wanted to understand the Torah. The Torah was still an important part of their identity, but they no longer were fluent in Hebrew. And so if they wanted to stay with their knowledge of the Torah had to be translated into Greek. Now, once again, we have two different versions of how this happened in the historical record. Again, neither of these stories are contemporaneous with this moment when the Torah was translated into Greek. Both of them were written down later. But once again, we're going to see that same tension we saw with Alexander. Now, the first of these sources is kind of a mystery. I was just reading up on it right before we started. We don't know a lot about this source. All we know for sure is it was written probably sometime around 200 BCE. And it was almost definitely written in Alexandria, Egypt, the largest city in Alexander's empire, the Ptolemaic Empire. And it was almost definitely, no, it was definitely written by a Jew. Beyond that, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know why he wrote it, but it survived in the historical record, and it describes the translation of the Torah. It's called the Letter of Aristeas, and it describes a situation where the librarian of the great library of Alexandria tells his king, King Ptolemy II, that he needs one of every book, and he heard the Jews have this fantastic book, but it's in Hebrew, a language that none of them understand. So wouldn't it be great if we can get people to translate it for us? And so they get these, they write a letter to the high priest in Israel to send them translators. He sent it to them. They translate the Torah into Greek, and then we get this passage. When the work was completed, Demetrius collected together the Jewish population in the place where the translation had been made and read it over to all in the presence of the translators, who met with a great reception also from the people because of the great benefit which they had conferred upon them. After the books had been read, the priests and the elders, the translators and the Jewish community and the leaders of the people stood up and said that since so excellent and sacred and accurate a translation had been made, it was only right that it should remain as it was and no alterations should be made in it. When the matter was reported to the king, he rejoiced greatly, for he felt that the design which he had formed had been safely carried out. The whole book was read over to him, and he was greatly astonished at the spirit of the lawgiver. So a Jew around the year 200 in Alexandria is talking about the moment when the Torah was translated into Greek, and he thinks it's awesome. He is really into it. What a fantastic translation. A little bit later, the rabbis of the Chazal, the rabbis writing the Mishnah and the Gemara, they also write about this moment in Masechet Megillah, and they have a slightly different version of what transpired. It happened to Ptolemy, the king, that he took 72 elders from Jerusalem and placed them in 72 separate chambers and did not inform them to what purpose he had brought them. And afterward he entered to each of them and said to them, translate me the Torah of Moses from memory. And the Holy One, blessed be he, sent into the heart of each of them a counsel, and they all agreed to have one mind. Now you have to sort of read between the lines here, as it's Gemara, and it's a little bit terse. But there's a sense that Ptolemy is just taking these people, telling them to translate the Torah by heart, and the sense is if they don't all give him the same thing, something terrible will happen. But a miracle occurs, and they translate it well, and everything's fine. Now, because of this sort of trepidation at this moment, we're actually about to commemorate the day that this transpires, because according to Chazal, the day in which the Torah was translated into Greek is Asara B'Tevet, a fast day. We fast on the day the Torah was translated into Greek, according to Chazal. So for them, this was not a good thing. This was a bad thing. It would have been better in their mind if the Torah was not Greek. So once again, we see this tension. Was it good that the Torah was translated? Was it bad? There's a lot that you can look into that with that. So, but before we go do a little bit further, this translation still exists today. This old translation, we call it the Septuagint, which is a really awkward name. It comes from the number 70 in Greek, the 70 people who translated it. And oftentimes scholars just shorten it to the Greek numbers, or actually Roman numerals, LXX, which means 70 in Roman numerals. And so that's the shorthand for it among scholars. And if you compare our text of the Torah to the Greek translation, you can find a number of really interesting deviations that tell you a lot about what the translators were doing. I often tell my students, translation is a form of interpretation. It is impossible to perfectly translate things from one language to another. You can try and do it word by word, or you can try and capture the essence of something, but no matter what, things are going to get lost. So I often tell them, like, imagine if you wanted to translate raining cats and dogs into Hebrew. You could say, oh, geshem chatulim kalavim, but that's just gibberish. That doesn't mean anything in Hebrew. That idiom does not exist. You could say harbe geshem, a lot of rain, but then you sort of lose that cats and dogs thing. So imagine if I had a sentence, it was raining cats and dogs, and boy, was it rough. And that's like a really bad dad joke, but you can't translate that into Hebrew, not easily anyway. A friend of mine told me that they were once watching an old Three Stooges bit where there was a translation into Hebrew, And in the, I'm sorry, not the Stooges, the Marx Brothers. And in the Marx Brothers bit, they were trying to surprise someone, and the person wasn't realizing that they were supposed to be surprised. So they tried to let them know we're surprising you. So they give them some soup, and they give them some rice, and they're like, soup, rice, surprise. And in the Hebrew translation, it just said, Marak Orez, hata'a, which of course doesn't make any sense. So it's very hard to do a very faithful translation. You always have to make decisions as a translator. So let me just show you a few little examples of this. I'm going to skip that one. So this is just from the parsha just a few weeks ago. This is from the territory with Dinah and Shem. In the Torah, in our version of the Torah, in the Masoretic text, it goes, the sons of Jacob answered Shem and his father Hamor with guile because they had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised. But in the Greek translation, they change a number of aspects of it. And Shimon and Levi, the brother of Dinah, said to them, we will not be able to do this thing to give our sister to a man who is uncircumcised. Look at the changes they make here. Instead of saying the sons of Jacob, all of the Jews at the time, it's just two of them, meaning not all the Jews were involved in this. Instead of saying they were tricky with Hamor, they just excise that completely. And they also don't mention that their sister was defiled. Non-Jews might be able to read this book, and they want the Jews to come off in a good light. So they excise or alter any things that might show that. So they're comfortable literally altering the word of God so that they don't look bad in the process. They're aware that their non-Jewish counterparts, their neighbors, might come across this book. Now, there are a few other interesting examples of this. And Moses, and this is from the Torah, this is in a few weeks from now in Shemot, and Moshe and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up and they saw the God of Israel. That is a direct translation. They saw the God of Israel, whatever that means. But in the Septuagint, and Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up and they saw the place of where God stood. They purposely make it more confusing because they were very uncomfortable with the translators of people seeing God, because that sort of went against their idea of God. It also went against the Greek idea of God. You can't see God or gods. That's not how that works. So they altered the translation to show that that's not how we understand this concept anymore. Let me just give you my favorite example, also from Shemot. And that's Moses, Moshe, and he put his hand to his chest, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous, sarat, as white as snow. And in the Greek translation, and he put his hand to his chest, and when he took it out, his hand had become like snow. They cut out that word sarat, that word leprous. That seems odd. Why do that? This is when at the sneh, at the burning bush, when God is giving Moses all these wonders he can do to the Egyptians. Well, to understand this, you have to understand something else. One of the largest Jewish communities in the world at the time was in Egypt. And you can imagine it kind of being weird. The Jews are in Egypt. Every year they're celebrating Pesach. Every year they're celebrating how their ancestors walloped the Egyptians. And maybe their neighbors didn't like that so much. And so the non-Jewish Egyptians, today I guess we call it trolling, they decided to start trolling the Jews, and they came up with a counter narrative, a different version of the story of Exodus. So we have this has been saved. A man named Diodorus Siculus wrote, the ancestors of the Jews had been driven out of all of Egypt as men who were impious and detested by the gods. For by way of purging the country of all persons who had white or leprous marks on their bodies, had been assembled and driven across the border as being under a curse. Your God didn't make all these miracles to get you out of Egypt. We kicked you out of Egypt because you were all lepers and we didn't want you here anymore and you were detested by the gods. Egyptians would retort to the Jews when they talked about the Exodus story. And notice that thing, they had leprosy. They don't want to give their detractors any ammunition. So when they translate the Torah into Greek, they just wipe out Moses, the hero of the story, definitely didn't have leprosy. You're not going to get any help from us to spread your rumors or gossip. What these translations show us is the translators were very well aware, not just of the Greek language, but of Greek culture. They were aware of the larger culture they were living in, and they adapted their translation to fit that. So that's a cool source. But I can show you even cooler sources than that. Because the longer Jews lived under Greek control, they started to get very creative with the type of things they were writing. And amazingly, a bunch of these things have survived to this day. So for instance, probably the most famous literary form that the Greeks used was the epic. Think of the Odyssey and the Iliad by Homer. Super famous books. Homer was so, he is the only non-Jewish author quoted in the Mishnah. The Chazal talk about the works of Homerus as something that you're not supposed to read in certain circumstances. So Homer was a big deal. Everyone knew Homer. Jews knew Homer. Everyone knew Homer at the time. Well, if epics were so popular, Jews decided, some Jews at least, why don't we write our own? Especially these Jews in Egypt. And so in Egypt, we have this fantastic source. It's called the story of Yosef and Osnat. And it's this whole, I like to think of it as fan fiction of the story of Yosef and Osnat. So Osnat's a relatively minor character in the Torah. She marries Joseph after he's taken out, after he's freed from jail. She's a mother of Ephraim and Manasseh. We're told that she is the daughter of Potiphera Kohen On. She's the daughter of this priest of Egypt, but we don't know that much about her. So for the Jews living in Egypt, they wanted to know more about her, so they wrote this awesome story. And it's sort of part romance, part adventure story, where at first it's sort of like a Ross and Rachel thing, where like she likes him, but he doesn't like her, and then he likes her and she doesn't like him, which is back and forth. It's very cute. And then of course they end up together. And then like everyone in Egypt's mad at Joseph that he gets to marry her because everyone wants to marry her. So he has to like fight them off using magic. It's really cool. And it's written in the style of ancient Greek literature. So let me show you a passage. It's not the most exciting passage, but it works for my purpose. So here's a passage from the story of Yosef and Osnat. And Osnat, large room where she spent her time, had 3 windows. One window looked out over the courtyard to the east. The second looked to the north onto the street, and the third to the south, and a golden bed stood in the room facing the east. And the bed had a coverlet of purple woven with gold, embroidered with blue and fine linen. In this bed, Osnat used to sleep alone, and no man or woman ever sat upon it except Osnat only. And there was a great court all around the house, and a wall around the court, very high, and built of great rectangular stones, and there were 4 gates at the court. This is so boring, I'm sorry. But there's a reason why I'm doing this pitch. Greeks love details. They love details of physical things. There's basically an entire chapter of the Iliad where Homer just describes what Achilles' shield looks like. It's like the second to last chapter. And so just to give you a little sense of that, this is Homer describing Achilles' shield. Then he first made a shield, broad and solid, adorned skillfully everywhere, and setting around it a glittering triple rim with a silver strap attached. 5 layers it had, and he goes on and on and on of all the pictures on the shield. This is how Greeks write. They love details of tangible things. And so when the Jewish writer of Joseph and Osnat is writing his story, he's writing it in Greek style. But epic wasn't the only style of Greek literature. Another very famous one that has survived to us today is Greek drama. Think Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides. Many of these plays have survived to us today. And there were very set rules for what a Greek play was like. You only have 1, 2, or 3 people on stage at a time. All the action happens off stage. Big things are often reported by some sort of scout or messenger. All these different things that were the hallmarks of Greek drama. Most Greek plays that were written haven't survived, only like the most famous ones. And only what we call the golden age of Greek drama. But what's fascinating is we know many other plays were written during the Hellenistic time period, during the time period after Alexander the Great. But only one play and fragments of it have survived, and that is a play written by a Jew, Egypt, about the story of the Exodus. It was written by a man named Ezekiel, the tragedian. The reason why parts of it have been saved is actually Christian scholars in the early years, church fathers, wrote it down and they transcribed segments of it. And so that's how it has survived to us today. But this Jewish themed play, in a Greek style, is the only existing example of Hellenistic drama that has survived to us to this day. And so let me just give you 2 little excerpts of it. So this is a portion between Moses and Yitro or Reuel. So Moses goes to Ruel. I had a vision of a great throne on the top of Mount Sinai, and it reached to the folds of heaven. A noble man was sitting on it with a crown and a large scepter in his left hand. He beckoned to me with his right hand, so I approached and stood before the throne. He gave me the scepter and instructed me to sit on the great throne. Then he gave me the royal crown and got up from the throne. I beheld the whole earth all around and saw beneath the earth and above the heavens a multitude of stars fell before my knees, and I counted them all. They paraded past me like a battalion of men. Then I awoke from my sleep in fear. And then Reuel says, my friend, this is a good sign from God. May I live to see the day when these things are fulfilled. You will establish a great throne, become a judge and the leader of men. As for your visions of the whole earth, the world below and that above the heavens, this signifies that you will see what it is, what has been, and what shall be. So this is not in the Torah. None of it is. The author, Ezekiel, he is writing this new vision of Moses, and it's very purposeful. He wants Yitro, a non-Jewish person, to give advice to Moses, which actually does happen in the Torah, but he's sort of highlighting again this sort of coexistence between Jews and non-Jews, how they can get along and understand the world in similar ways. But there's an even weirder thing. At the very end of the surviving passages, a scout is reporting back to Moses after the splitting of the sea, what he saw after, because again, they don't have the budget to make a large sea splitting scene on stage. So rather than have it happen in real time, someone reports back. So this is what a scout says to Moses after the splitting of the sea. We saw something else too, a strange and remarkable creature, such as no man has seen before. He was about twice the size of an eagle and has multicolored wings. His breast was purplish and his legs red. From his neck, saffron tresses hung beautifully. His head was like that of a rooster. He gazed all around with his yellow eye, which looked like a seed. He had the most wonderful voice. Indeed, it seemed like he was the king of the birds, for all of them followed him in fear. He strode in front like an exultant bull, lifting his foot in swift step. Now, this might sound super weird to us, and this definitely is not in any Mishnah or Midrash or Torah I've ever seen, but someone back then would recognize this right away. The scout is describing the phoenix. The phoenix was this mythical bird that was a sign of regeneration and rebirth, and it appeared only a few times in Greek history. And what they're saying is, look, this big thing that you guys talk about, it was there for us too. This was a big moment for us. And so, of course, the phoenix made an appearance for us, combining Greek mythology with the Jewish story. And so these Jews are proud of their Jewish heritage. When they're writing about their heroes, but they're doing it in a Greek way. They're not being persecuted for being Jewish. They're being Jewish, and they're being in a Greek world, seem to be getting along just fine. And this is all happening before the Hanukkah story. And so what I'm getting at is, for over 150 years, Jews living in the Greek world, as far as we can tell, were doing just fine. They were assimilating to a degree, but they were maintaining their Jewish identity. You don't have a big project like translating the Torah into Greek if you don't care about the Torah. You do that if you do care about it and you want to make sure people still understand it, even if they don't speak Hebrew anymore. So then what happened with the story of Hanukkah? From what we can tell, it's a little bit complicated. Originally, the Egyptian part of Alexander's empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, controlled Israel. And under those circumstances, the Jews got along with them. The main leader of the Jews, as far as we can tell, was the Kohen Gadol. So not only was he the religious leader, the high priest, he was also sort of like their political liaison with power. And that worked until it stopped working. Because in 198, the Seleucid Empire conquered Israel. And now the Jewish leadership was exiled because they were allies with the Ptolemies. But he wasn't just a leader, he was the high priest. And the Seleucids come in and they have no idea how to deal with the Jews. They've never dealt with a population like the Jews before. And so all of a sudden, the high priest job, which is supposed to be a religious job first, is mishandled. And the Seleucids give it to people who are unworthy of it. And eventually, it just becomes a position that certain Kohanim just pay bribes to get. This is why Matityahu and his children leave Jerusalem. They were Kohanim, and they were very upset that the kahuna, the priesthood, was being treated like a political pawn almost. And it's in this mess that there's already bad blood. There's already a grudge with these new leaders. The Seleucids don't understand the Jews. The Jews are upset with how the Seleucids are treating the priesthood. It's in this context that a new Seleucid leader comes to power, a man named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, Antiochus. And he is difficult. He doesn't get the Jews. He doesn't like their bickering over the high priesthood. And he's the one that does indeed make these laws banning aspects of Judaism, something that had just never happened before. This is an anomaly. This is not the normal thing Greek kingdoms do with the Jews. It's not happening in Egypt at this time. And this is why the Maccabean Revolt happens around the year 167. They rebel against this under the leadership of the Maccabees, of the Hashmonaim, these people who left Jerusalem earlier because they didn't like how the priesthood was being treated. And then something interesting happens. They win. The Maccabees win. They are guerrilla fighters. They manage to kick the Greeks out, and they rededicate the temple that had been defiled, all that good stuff. It was a military victory. And then the Maccabees decided, there's already this tradition that the Kohen is the political leader. We're Kohanim, so let's become both the Kohen and the political leader, the king and the Kohen. Now, this had never been done before. This was something new. And over time, later generations would say the descendants of the Maccabees were inappropriate in taking both of these roles. They also did something that has never been done before or since. The grandchildren or nephews of Judah the Maccabee, they forcefully converted people to Judaism. This is the only time in history that this ever happened. And later Jewish leaders were very upset with that. And so the Maccabees make all these holidays, celebrating their victories, the most famous of them being Hanukkah, which becomes a mainstay of the Jewish calendar. Happens at near the solstice, the winter solstice. That's already a significant time of the year. And so they make this big celebration. But they make many other holidays as well. But eventually they are removed from office. The Romans conquer Israel. They install Herod, who wasn't even really Jewish. He was a descendant of one of those people who were forcibly converted. And that's the end of them. And later on, at the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, Chazal have very mixed feelings about the Maccabees. Look what they say. Famously, there's no Masechet Hanukkah or Masechet Nerot. You want to learn about Hanukkah, you basically can look at one page on Masechet Shabbat. The Gemara asks, what is Hanukkah and why are lights kindled on Hanukkah? The Gemara answers, the sages taught in Megillah Ta'anit, on the 25th Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. One may not eulogize on them. One may not fast on them. What is the reason? When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary by touching them. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious over them, they searched and found only one cruse of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest, undisturbed by the Greeks. And there was sufficient oil there to light the candelabrum for only one day. A miracle occurred, and they lit the candelabrum for 8 days. The next year, the sages instituted these days and made them holidays. Now, here's the thing. This is the first time this story is anywhere in the historical record. The Maccabees wrote 4 different books. It's not mentioned once, the miracle of the oil there. Chazal wanted to minimize the Maccabees. The miracle wasn't about a victory, according to them. It was about a little cruse of oil that no one could see because the menorah is in the temple and closed to the public. A better example of how the Chazal wanted to minimize the Maccabees, and I told you the Maccabees made many holidays. Hanukkah was their big one. We still have that one. But their second biggest one was a day called Yom Nicanor. That was a day of a major military victory. Now, we still make a big deal of Yom Nicanor, but we don't call it that anymore. We call it Tanat Esther. This big holiday for the Maccabees, Chazal turns it into a fast day. In the story of Purim, Esther does not fast the day before Purim. She fasts a few weeks after the decree is made, a few days after the decree is made, which is in Nisan. That's when she actually fasts. Chazal moved the fast day to the day before Purim to turn the Maccabee holiday into a fast day because they did not like the Maccabees. And so this is why Hanukkah is the way it is today. This is why we have this distinction. So with our last few minutes, I want to point this in a different direction. Very often people like to say Hanukkah is a holiday where we throw off assimilation, acculturation, we're proud to be Jewish. And that's the version of the Maccabees. But Chazal kind of got rid of that version. We don't have a Megillah. We don't have a book in Tanakh about them. We don't have a Masechet in the Gemara about Hanukkah. So we don't have a lot to go on in our religious liturgy, in our religious books and lore and things like that. And so over the years, something really interesting happened to Hanukkah. A holiday that was founded to Jews fighting off others became something very different. Let me show you just a few little examples. My professor in Yeshiva University, Stephen Fine, pointed this out to me years ago. Throughout history, Chanukiot often resemble houses of worship in the area where Jews live. So in 15th century France, you have a rose window as found in Gothic churches on this Chanukiah. In Morocco, you have the horseshoe arches found in prominent Middle Eastern architecture on their Chanukiah. In 19th century Germany, you once again have Gothic style tracery and windows in their Chanukiah. There are no Gothic church synagogues, by the way. You only have Gothic churches. In Poland, you have the double-headed eagle of the royal Russian family on the Chanukiah. In 18th century Italy, you have neoclassical style columns and arches on their Chanukiah. And lastly, in Syria, you have Arabic as well as Hebrew and Arabic designs all over the Chanukiah. And Sarah, maybe you could read that Arabic. I don't know how to read Arabic. So in large Judaica collections, the Jewish Museum in New York, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, they often will display Chanukiot. And it's quite, oh, so of course you have the Muslim crescent moon on top as well, this one. You will often be, it'll be very, someone who has knowledge of art history can very easily tell where and when the Chanukiah was from, just based upon the architecture of the mostly Gentile architecture of that time period. So the very symbol of Hanukkah is often a symbol of coexistence, of acculturation, of to a degree of cultural assimilation. But I can do better than that. All of these visuals are fun. Oh, one more. Gotta love this one, the Statue of Liberty, Hanukkah, 20th century America. Take all the other aspects of Hanukkah that we have today. The dreidel. When I was a kid, I was told that Jews weren't allowed to learn the Torah back in the time of the Seleucid Greeks. So they would study, and when the Greeks would check on them, they'd just put the Torah away and play dreidel and say, we're just playing tops, we're not doing anything. So the earliest historical evidence of the dreidel isn't a Jewish device at all. It's an English toy called a teetotum, which later migrated to Germany, where it was called a trundle, which is where we get the Yiddish word dreidel. And here we see a picture from the great painter Bruegel the Elder of a woman holding a trundle, a four-sided top. And on the four-sided top, there would be an SH, an H, an N, and a G for the four different things the top could do. You can get half, you can take the whole. I always forget the rules of dreidel, but it's the rules of dreidel in German. And then later, it was just, this was a popular toy. It was often played at Christmas time. The nights start early. You need something to do by candlelight. And Jews adopted it and made it Jewish by turning those German letters into Hebrew letters. And once you had the letters, that's where you would get eventually Nes Gadol Hayasham. That's where that came from. So a symbol of Hanukkah, the holiday that's supposedly about Jews not acculturating, is yet another example of Jews acculturating. Let me give you an even better one, though. What would Hanukkah be without latkes? So, and I've always told, latkes are to commemorate the miracle of the oil, which again is the Chazal version of the Hanukkah story. But boy, are latkes not traditional Hanukkah. First of all, latkes, any self-respecting latke, is going to be made out of potatoes. And before the year 1492, every potato in the world was in South America. Potatoes are originally from the Andes Mountains. Not one Jew in the world had a potato before 1492. What did we do on Pesach? I don't know what we did on Pesach. It must have been awful. So you definitely didn't have potatoes, but you could still fry other things. The original latkes were not made out of potatoes. They were made out of buckwheat and rye, more like a real pancake. That was a very common fare. But those were the original ones in Northern Europe. As far as the historical record goes, the earliest known latkes were actually not fried buckwheat or rye. they were fried ricotta cheese in Sicily. And that's where they first had latkes, that we can tell. Fry them in oil, fried ricotta cheese, and that actually sounds delicious. And so what's that for? Why are we frying dairy? Jews don't get along with dairy very well. Where's that coming from? And so there was a very big tradition about the story of Yehudit, Judith, and Holofernes, that she fed him dairy, put him to sleep, and then killed him, sort of like another version of the Yael and Sisera story. But there's something weird about that. The story of Yehudit is not found in the Tanakh. It's what we call an apocryphal story, just like the book of Maccabees. It's a Jewish story written by Jews in the style of the Tanakh, but one that did not make it into the Tanakh. It was saved by Christians later on. Even more so, the story of Judith and Holofernes is not about the Greeks. That's a very common misconception. It's actually a story about the Assyrians, Ashur, a much earlier empire. Many people think the reason for the confusion is the story has a similar feel to the Hanukkah story, and Yehudit and Yehuda HaMaccabee have very similar names. And so why do we have latkes again? Because people in South Italy got confused about a story that's not in Tanakh, and then it migrated to Northern Europe, and then eventually we replaced it with potatoes 500 years ago. Many different Jewish experiences are coming together there. So I read this in an article. So what's a latke? It's a shredded Andean tuber fried like a buckwheat pancake, which was substituted for Italian cheeses, once eaten to honor a mistaken reading of obscure variants of an apocryphal text. That's what latkes are. And lastly, and my favorite example of all, what would Hanukkah be without sufganiyot? What would Hanukkah be without jelly donuts? Well, before 500 years ago, actually more recently, 300 years ago, almost no one ever had sugar. Sugar was a very expensive delicacy. You needed slave labor to make it, which just made it more profitable and accessible to people. But no one was having fried sweet donuts in the shtetl years ago. Sufganiyot are a much more recent invention. Basically, in Israel, in the 1930s, under the Histadrut, Israel had lots of kibbutzim, all these workers working on kibbutz, but you don't always have that much to do in the wintertime. Right after the harvest, you'd have all these people who might not have as much work to do. So the Histadrut encouraged kibbutzim and other places that would hire people seasonally, that after the harvest, people should make a very time-consuming thing that they could profit on, and that was sufganiyot. It is very hard to make a good sufganiyah. It takes a lot of time and energy and skill. So that's what you do in a more socialized country that like pre-state Israel was with all their kibbutzim. They put them to work, and that's where sufganiyot come from. And so every single aspect of how we celebrate Hanukkah today is actually a symbol of how Judaism has adapted to their surroundings over the years. It's sort of the opposite of the foundation of the story, where it was Jews fighting against that. And the reason for that, the pivot, is because of Chazal. Chazal removed all of the origins of Hanukkah because they did not like the people who made Hanukkah happen. But without those origins, there was nothing to bolster the foundation of Hanukkah. So it made it very easy to change with the times in a way that other holidays don't, because other holidays have sacred texts and Masechtot and Gemara talking about them and all these things, but Hanukkah doesn't. So that's the irony. The holiday that was started as a fighting against outside pressure became one that more than any other shows Jews acculturating and assimilating with other cultures. And of course, today, there's no better example of that. My children look forward to it every year. The Maccabees or 613 Hanukkah mashup. Every year, you have these a cappella groups singing about Hanukkah in different modern contemporary music styles. Or, I love the 613 has one where it's all Star Wars themed. This year, they did one that was West Side Story themed. That too has now become a big tradition of Hanukkah as well. Okay, so that is 51 minutes. I've been talking for a very long time. I'm sure we have some questions. I have not been looking at the chat, but I will do so now. So let me just take a quick look. And if anyone else has any questions, you could feel free. Sarah, how do we do this? Do people just unmute themselves and ask you a question, or do we prefer to do it through the chat?
There's Yona has a question in the chat. I had a question in the chat, and people should feel free to raise their hands and we can you can call on people. And I also got a few questions. Somebody asked me to ask a question. So, but let's start with, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Sarah, what were you saying? Let's start with what?
Let's start with Yona's question. How does Al-Hanisim, yeah.
How does Al-Hanisim, which seems much more celebratory than Maccabean, fit into the rabbinic disapproval? That is a fantastic question. I do not know the answer to that question, but it's a really, really good one. And it just shows, we never got rid of the Maccabean. Like they're still part of the story. They couldn't expunge them completely from the story, but it's why they minimized them. That's a partial answer. I don't have a better answer than that, but that is a very good question, Yona. Does anyone else have any questions?
So first of all, I had a question just about that play that by Ezekiel.
The Exegog. Yes.
Yes. So was this play actually performed? And if so, who was the intended audience? And do we have any ideas around the aesthetics and performance of the play?
It's a fantastic question. We don't know. We don't even have the whole play. We don't know if it was ever performed. We don't know if it was performed. Was it for a Jewish audience or a mixed audience? Those are fantastic questions. We know very little about it, but I don't get frustrated by that. It's amazing we have it at all. That's the cool thing about it, is that it survived in fragments, but we know nothing else about it. So that is frustrating, but it's cool that it has survived.
Shira has a question in the chat.
Shira, was Hanukkah 8 days from the beginning? My understanding is that it's because they couldn't celebrate Sukkot that year. Interesting. I've never heard that. It's possible. I don't know. I've only ever seen Hanukkah being celebrated for 8 days. I don't know. That is a good question. Do we have a sense that there was more tension with Greek culture in Israel versus in Egypt? Not really. I didn't include this before. But I did discuss how the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, worked with the Egyptian Greek rulers for over 100 years. We have no evidence of conflict. In fact, when the Seleucids conquered Israel, the high priest, whose name was Onias, he left with his crew to Egypt, and this is something that Chazal even mentioned. He started his own Beit HaMikdash in Egypt. He continued to give sacrifices in Egypt. And Chazal had this whole dispute. If those Kohanim returned to Israel, would they be allowed to worship in the temple? And there's a machloket. Some of Chazal say, no, they can't, but others say, yeah, they can, sure. So there's a disagreement about just how bad it was what Onias did. I often tell people, our whole notion that there was a first temple and a second temple is really silly, because while there was a first temple, there were 3 second temples and then many other temples as well at that time. Ezra and Nehemiah built a temple, then it was completely rebuilt by the Maccabees, and then it was rebuilt again by Herod, and that's the famous one that we have all the pictures of. And there was a temple in Elephantine in Egypt. There was a temple of Onias in Leontopolis. So there were a number of Jewish temples during the Second Temple era. So the idea of a first or second temple is kind of a misnomer. Any other questions?
Eitan, I got a couple of questions in the chat. One question was around those images on the menorahs and why they ended up on menorahs and not on synagogues, or were they like the some of the Gothic imagery? You said there's no Gothic synagogues, but yeah.
So amongst synagogue architecture is a really interesting field. For most of European history, synagogues tended to be smaller things. You think of some of the more famous ones that have survived, like the Alta Neue Shul in Prague. That was inspired by a Gothic aesthetic, certainly on the interior, less so on the exterior. But in general, Jewish synagogues in Northern Europe were of a smaller fare. Southern Europe's a little bit different. But normally, Jewish architecture was consistent with the architecture of the time period. Not always architecture of like houses of worship, but more of a secular architecture. There's a really interesting story about why Jewish synagogues in Northern Europe look like they do. And they're sort of mimicking parts of monasteries that they would trade with. Jews didn't go into the religious parts of the monasteries, but they would often go into something called the chapter house, where they could do business with the monks. And they often use those buildings to copy for their shuls. In fact, if you've been to the Cloisters Museum in Washington Heights, there's this interesting room there with this twin nave, these two columns where the arches come down and support the roof. And an old professor at Stern College named Rachel Visnicher, she hypothesized that that actual room in the cloisters was an inspiration for shuls like the Altneu Shul. And so Jews often did gain inspiration from more secular architecture in Europe when it comes to shul. But again, the thing about Hanukkah is it's such a flexible holiday because we don't have much of a religious foundation for it, that it made things more open to being exposed to or inspired by more secular things. Yes.
Can you hear me? I have a question.
Sure.
I was a little confused about Jews not speaking Hebrew.
Sure.
And how did that happen? Where they spoke Greek, but not Hebrew?
So that's a two-part question. The first is, as far as we can tell, the Hebrew of the Tanakh was not a spoken Hebrew. It's what we would call a literary language, just like the language that Homer used to write the Odyssey and the Iliad was not a language people spoken. It was a language people used to write important things in. There's a debate if the Hebrew of the Tanakh was ever actually spoken, or whether it was a special literary language. Jews, from basically the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, Jews stopped speaking Hebrew. After them, they started speaking Aramaic, which was the main language of the Middle East for centuries. And then over time, they adapted to the main language of the time. It's the same reason why I'm speaking English to you and not Yiddish right now. I live in an English-speaking country. And so it was the same thing back then. Jews were in a predominantly Greek-speaking space, so they started to speak Greek as their main language. Yeah.
Eitan, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, yeah. So let's see. Is there any evidence of civil war amongst the Jews in Hanukkah? Right. So the whole Mitjavnim versus the Jews, that story, it probably did happen. I think the book of Maccabees does indeed describe that. So yeah, there is evidence of Jew on Jew violence at that time. And then right, Gelt on Hanukkah also assimilation because of presents for Christmas. I don't have a source for this, but I always assumed we give presents on Hanukkah because non-Jews give presents on Christmas. I don't know if like back in the shtetl people were getting gifts on Hanukkah or not. I think they or just got Gelt, whatever that was. So yeah, I don't have a source for that, but that was always my assumption. Another example of assimilation there. Yes. Any other questions?
Another question that came in is the fact that the Maccabees rose up in armed revolt, also evidence of a type of acculturation to Greek and Hellenistic lifestyles.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
I think the question is the fact that the Maccabees themselves rising up in armed revolt and engaging in this type of guerrilla warfare, is that in itself a type of acculturation and borrowing from the Greeks?
Well, the Greeks definitely did not fight in guerrilla warfare style. They fought in the exact opposite way, a super organized system known as a phalanx. It was the antithesis of guerrilla fighting. So they were not fighting like Greeks at all. And up until that point, there was nothing weird about the idea of Jews taking up arms. We have a number of examples from history of Jews fighting. It's in the Tanakh. We have the Elephantini letters from Persia of a Jewish garrison in southern Egypt. So I don't think that would have been viewed as un-Jewish at the time. I don't know of that being the case, at least. Any other questions? The same.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Eitan. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody. for
And
coming. and
happy
learning
Hanukkah,
together.
everyone.
Happy Hanukkah.